Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for the participants to join the call. We will start the webinar in just a moment. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Again, thank you for joining us. We'll start in just a moment. We're just waiting for all of our participants to come on. Again, if you're just joining us now, we're just waiting a couple more moments for people around the country and frankly around the world to join us for this wonderful conversation. We will start in just one moment. Okay. Good day, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from around the world. Greetings from Seattle myself. I am David Kivo, the Chief Development Officer of the American Technion Society, and I'd like to personally welcome you to the second of our weekly virtual speaker series called Live from Israel, webinars from Technion experts. And before we begin, I just want to wish each of you who's joining us today, hoping that you and your loved ones are safe during this time of isolation and that you feel a sense of connection to our Technion community. And I'd just like to add that since 1912 or 1924, depending when you mark the beginning of the Technion's opening, the Technion has been focused on ensuring the economy and security of Israel. Yet today, what really speaks to the Technion's mission is how it benefits the world, benefits us at this unusual time. And we are here together to learn. For those of you who may have joined us last week, we had Professor Avi Schroeder, and we hope that you found that talk to be informative and inspiring. And I'm reflecting on the words that he shared with us at the end, in which he said, and I'm quoting, the Technion is a community. We are a family and we're here to help each other as much as we can. Technion looks to help wherever we can around the world. And I think those words are very true and will be lived out in our conversation today. Today's program will again center around the impact of COVID-19, namely how we can deal with the stresses of an outbreak like this. And our special guest today is Technion Associate Professor Asya of the Technion's Rappaport Faculty of Medicine. She's a professor of immunology and of neuroscience whose lab studies the physiological mechanisms related to how emotions and thoughts affect our physical health. She's also a proud alumna who received her bachelor's and master's degrees from the Technion, and she has a PhD from the Weizmann Institute of Science and conducted her postdoctoral work in the US at Stanford University. I'd like to add that the work of Professor Roll's lab is made possible from grants from the European Research Council and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, along with extraordinary Technion supporters such as Jewel and Alan Prince of Florida, who helped establish the Prince Center in Neuroscience, and Joan and Erwin Jacobs of San Diego, who provide many of the fellowships for the graduate students working in her lab. Professor Rolls and her team have identified neuronal pathways where one's positive expectations have an effect on how the body fights germs, a very relevant and timely subject during these times. Before we start the program, Please know that if you have any questions for Professor Rolls during the course of this call, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your webinar window. We will hold all questions until after her presentation, and my colleague Jerry Kleinman will be moderating the Q&A. Asya, the proverbial mic is all yours. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy that you were able to join us today, and I'm happy to be here today. I think it is definitely a family, and these are very special times for everyone. I think very challenging, but I think also times that offer a lot of personal opportunities for people to grow. So I hope you are taking this chance as well. So I guess it's about time. I'm supposed to talk about my work, and I'm happy to do that. I think really that it's a very special time, because it's also a time that it exposes us to a lot of new emotions. Maybe not all of them are new, but definitely very deep and strong emotions. And our work is basically focused on this connection on how emotions, how our thoughts affect our physiology, and specifically the ability to cope with disease. And I will talk today, actually, I will begin talking a little bit first on two types of emotions that I think are very common in this time, and definitely not surprising, which is stress and loneliness. And I think stress, it's quite obvious, right? This is really challenging time. We don't know what's going to happen. It's quite dramatic. And I think it's obvious that we all feel stress to some extent. And the connection between stress and immunity is over there. It's all over. There's a strong literature, epidemiological data, and we know it personally as well, that stress affects the way we can cope with disease. The thing is that we need to understand that stress is not a uniform kind of state. Stress has different components. And it's not that all stressors are suppressing of the immune system. For example, acute stressors are actually good. They are boosting the immune response. They're part of the way that our body prepares us to cope with any kind of challenge, including potentially if we have a lion over there or something else, it also boosts our immune system. So in fact, acute stress is actually something that can be very good, and we cannot function if our stress systems are not working. We are actually also, our physiology is really dramatically affected in a bad way. We cannot mount many of the responses that are essential for our survival. So, and there is a lot of very interesting data showing that actually stress, if people think positively about it, if people believe that stress is something that is good for them and that they actually strive of them, it actually can be really beneficial on the other hand. And there is now a lot, and the thing is that we still don't understand how it works, how it really works, because there are different physiological mechanisms that are interacting there. And this is something that we are actually working on, trying to understand, to decipher the different components. I think in general, the way we are looking on that, we're trying to understand how all these connections, how our thoughts can eventually affect our physiology. And I will describe that in a few minutes, how we think and what we are understanding on top of that. I just want to talk about the other aspect, the aspect of loneliness. And loneliness, there is now a lot of literature talking about loneliness and how it affects the ability of the organism to fight any kind of infection, like actually, especially viruses. And this is interesting because the idea is that evolutionary, we evolved as social animals, right? And social animals have a lot of exposure to viruses. And if people are, that way, neuronal pathways that are involved in socializing are actually also activating specific pathways in the immune system. And there were several studies taking people that are, for example, they asked people for how lonely they feel. And this is not how lonely they feel, it's actually even more interesting, how socially supported they feel. And these people, there was a difference in the way they could cope with viruses, like a rhinovirus that causes common cold. And even there was a researcher who tested 22,000 genes in the genome, and he found that about 200 of them were changed. but these were not random genes. And he was looking on two groups of people that felt not socially supported and those who didn't feel socially supported. And apparently the genes that were different between them, these 200 genes, they were not random. These were genes that were mainly related to viral infections. And it's interesting because it's probably part of the pathway. So they had more inflammation in general, but the pathways fighting viruses were reduced in these people. But what I want to emphasize that it wasn't how many people they had around them. It was how many interactions they had and how they felt supported. And I'm telling that in this time because I think it's really, in these times where we are confined to our homes and we are kind of, this social isolation is forced on us. Actually, it's not about being in physical touch with the other people. It's about being connected. So I think it's a great opportunity to actually foster this because we have all these Zoom connections and being part of something bigger and this togetherness. There are even studies showing that being connected to something, togetherness, all these feelings are actually feelings that are correlated with better ability to cope with viruses. And I will talk about how it's happening, I think. And I think it's also one of the other things that seems to work very intensely for people that is very much correlated with the activity and the effectiveness of the immune system is how much people have this sense of meaning or doing something bigger from like eudaimonic happiness. There was a study comparing people that are hedonically happy just because their needs are fulfilled and people who are eudaimonically happy, that have a bigger goal, something bigger. And even in these people, just differentiating people that were happy, there were differences in their genes. So it's a good time actually maybe to have something bigger. Many projects, maybe people take on many projects on them actually, but it's funny, we are located next to Rambam and the people there in the orthopedic department, they were sure that they are not going to have any people out there because people are not going out there, so no one is going to hurt itself, what's going to happen. But apparently the department is full with new people because everyone are taking projects and they're cutting fingers and parts. So actually, if you are taking a project, maybe be careful anyway. But it's a very interesting time. Okay. But my work is focused on something a little bit different. We're trying to understand the positive part of that. And I want to tell you, just to show you an example, I'm going to share my screen for a second. And I'm going to show you an example on how thoughts are really crucial, to what extent thoughts are actually crucial for your ability to cope with disease. And let me give you an example, but this is not even disease, just general physiology. There was a study done in Yale when they gave people two types of milkshakes. One was this indulgent milkshake and the other one, this skinny milkshake, this skinny milkshake. And they measured the level of a hormone, the hunger hormone called ghrelin. And of course, people that drank this indulgent milkshake, they had lower levels of this hunger hormone, right? And those who drank this skinny milkshake, they had higher levels of that. The thing is, it was exactly the same milkshake. So even the ability, and this is important for this time, so even if you're eating something at home a lot and fat, don't worry, as long as you think that it's something that is skinny, you're good. Or the opposite. Okay, so I just want to show you another example, pain, for example, and this is amazing just to see the potential embedded in our brain. So people took patients recovering and from surgery, and they gave them different drugs, analgesia, sorry. And once it was open injection, so give it once the patient knows that he's getting the drug. And the other one is a hidden application. When the patient doesn't know, the computer is just turning on the machine. And they compare how good or how effective the same drug was. What you see here, this is the example. You see here in orange, how effective the reduction in pain was when it was a hidden application. So the person didn't know that he's getting the drug. But here, This is the extent of reduction in pain when the person knew. So just think about that. This is the pharmacological effect, and this is the psychological one. There is a huge difference that, and it's for many different drugs. So there is a huge potential in our brain. And this is exactly what we are trying to understand in our lab. What we are trying to understand is how does it happen that our thoughts, like positive or negative, change so much our physiology. And the way we are thinking about that, we're saying, okay, every thought, every emotion is eventually reflected in specific brain activity, right? So all we need to ask is how the activity of the brain is affecting our physiology. So we are making this translation. We are saying, okay, for example, in placebo effect, when people have all these high hopes and expectations, how does that change their ability to cope with disease? So we know that when people have this positive expectation, there is a brain area called the reward system, and this area is activated. So we started, well, let's ask how activation of this brain area can change the ability of the body to cope with disease. So we activated this brain area in mice, and we extracted from them some cells from their blood and incubated them with bacteria. And then we plated them here. What you can see is these petri dishes, and you see how many bacteria remained after we activated their brain. And you see, this is in control. You see many more bacteria. And here you can see that just by activating the brain, they were able to kill the bacteria much more effectively. And we also did it, and we showed that actually also with tumors. We saw that if we activate the brain of mice that are experiencing tumors, we can reduce the size of the tumor by half. And I will do it fast, so you won't freak out. So just to show you that. Okay, so I will stop sharing, and I'm back here. So I think what we are seeing here is that basically the way our brain acts and what we think and how it eventually affects physiology. And we see that we have all these miracles, right? People are recovering from all these medical miracles. Of course, they are random, right? So we call them miracles. We don't understand, but something physiological happened there. For some reason, their body was able to activate some pathways that are able, for example, to kill the tumor or to do something else. So the question is, how do we right now it's random. We don't know how to use it. And what we are trying to do is that by understanding the different pathways, the connections between the brain and the immune system, for example, or actually other physiological systems, we're trying to understand what's going on so we can now boost and modulate it by now understanding and leave it from the miracle stage or placebo effect and actually use it in our treatments. So I hope that by doing that, we actually, I believe that by taking this direction, we can actually open a new aspects in physiology, new ways of treating disease that will eventually harness the endogenous pathways or the natural mechanisms that we have to fight either bacteria, cancer, or anything, or viruses like we are challenged now. So I will be happy to, if you ask me more specific questions, direct me. I will be happy to answer any kind of direction in this way.
Thank you very much, Asya, Professor Rolls, for your wonderful comments. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jerry Kleiman, in just a moment to lead us in the Q&A. I just wanted to share firstly that this particular session is being recorded and will be made available to others should they wish to watch it. So if you're enjoying this and would like to share it with a friend or a family member, or just like to watch it again, it will be available to you. And I just also wanted to mention that my appreciation for you speaking today. And while part of me wants to believe that if I drink a milkshake and I think positively about it, it won't be any added calories. I know that your research goes well beyond it. And I just also wanted to mention that I don't think it's an accident that this kind of research is happening in your lab and at the Technion and in Israel. the, the, the national anthem of the country is Hatikva, which means the hope. And I think that the whole nation and the whole Israeli people have this natural sense of looking for inspiration even when it is challenging. And now you have put this into scientific work for the benefit of the good of humankind. So thank you. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Jerry, to help facilitate our Q&A. Jerry, you're on mute, so you're going to have to try again.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Thank you, David. And thank you, Professor. We have a number of questions that have come in, and I think I'll lead with the first one that came in early. Are introverts more susceptible to illness?
Oh, this is a very interesting question, actually. And I don't have the answer, like all best questions. So I think there are some studies actually. I think it's also related to how people are satisfied with their state. And there are some studies actually even going back to patients with during the HIV epidemics. They were trying to correlate. Some people had a very fast decline and some had a very much more moderate. And apparently there was a correlation even in these people, which is such a severe virus that is attacking them. And it was correlated a lot with how they felt about their situation, how closeted they were. So I think it's more, not necessarily introvert and extroverts, is how you feel and how your connection about that. But I don't think there is a good enough, a lot of literature about that. Even, you know, even if you think of this literature about stress, it's not necessarily the stress itself, it's how the person thinks about the stress. So I think it's, if someone is comfortable in how he is, so it's not necessarily inducing anything negative.
So I'm trying to collect some of the questions together, and I see a couple that deal with body pain. And one gentleman refers to mind over back pain, and another one wants to know, are there any exercises or activities that appear to harness the brain's effect on the immune system? So I'm just curious about how this all works from a physical and neurological standpoint.
So basically, in the context of pain, I have to say pain is one of, not everyone responds to placebo, for example, but pain and irritable bowel disease, all these, for example, these are conditions that are very, very responsive to placebo and responsive to all these mental conditions. So they seem to be that not everything is equally regulated by the brain and not equally can be affected. So, and I think maybe this is an important point for me to emphasize in general. These are pathways that we are finding, but of course, it's very different between individuals, and what we are doing right now is still in an early stage of trying to decipher the pathways. I will mention in the end how we're trying to translate it to humans in a second. But there is a lot of work talking about the connection between pain and how we perceive pain. And I think some of the most interesting findings in the context of placebo, they're actually in pain, that people can get drugs that are completely, they're doing nothing, and it will just really inert substances, sugar pills, and they're improving very much in context of pain. Again, I don't think we understand the underlying mechanism, the pathways, how it's happening. I think now there are more and more studies looking, for example, into the brains of people experiencing pain. And we have a lot of work now starting on the context of pain, even in the context of migraines, for example. And but I think many of these pathways are still unknown. It appears that but there is a strong dialogue between pain and immune system. And for example, because we know that during infection, for example, we have more pain, there's the sensitivity to pain increases if you just, when you have, and apparently neurons that are passing pain, the information about pain, transferring the information, are actually sensitive to cytokines, which are compounds secreted by the immune system. So the immune system on itself can modulate the levels of pain, and we don't fully understand how it's working. We do have some some understanding about the interactions with these cytokines and about how we can use that. So I think as we're starting to uncover the pathways that are mediating how, for example, how this area of positive expectation is doing something to the changing the ability of the immune system to fight disease, we are trying now, and we discovered that in mice, right? So we just uncovered the pathways. But now we're working, for example, with Professor Talma Handler at Tel Aviv University, and she's doing this modulations of neurofeedback, fMRI-guided neurofeedback. So we can train people actually to control these different brain areas, and by doing that, we can actually affect potentially the immune system, but this can be applied actually to many other pathways. But we are in the stages of proving the potential there, and if it actually works in humans, I think it's going to be very exciting.
So I have two questions I see that fit together fairly well. If people are more satisfied or happy with their particular place in life, do they tend to be healthier? And the second is, Professor, what is the confidence limit in the majority of your positive thought assertion?
Well, I think most of the studies that when we're talking about these subjective measurements, and I think I'm not a psychologist, I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm mainly drawing inspiration from all these psychological studies, which a lot of them are done at correlation levels, because you're trying to understand, for example, correlations like satisfaction, for example, and all these factors and how they correlate with the health. Of course, there are many confounds that come in, and people who are more satisfied are probably taking more care of themselves. And so there are many factors that come in. I think one of the factors that is clearly correlated, and I think it's beyond any other confounds, is depression, which seems to affect physiology in a very dramatic way. So this is another aspect. But I think all these specific traits, you can find correlations, and of course there are wonderful studies that are being published on that, but they are not necessarily explaining how. And I think this is our biggest limit. About the confidence, I think once we are moving to experiments that we are proving specific connections, so we're activating very specifically the brain area in the mouse and looking on causality. So I can actually measure the changes in the blood. I can measure the changes, the response to tumors. So I think this is causal already. And this is something that we were able to prove. And of course, it's very important that others prove it as well. But I think in terms of establishing the connections there, it's more direct. The challenge is, of course, how we integrate it into complex creatures like humans.
So you may have covered part of this in the discussion, but two more questions coming from our friends. The symptoms of anxiety and panic, dizziness, shortness of breath, weakness are similar to COVID-19. How should people tell the differences or get clarity? And then the second question is, how do we differentiate between acute stressors versus anxiety?
Well, I do have to emphasize that I'm not a clinician. So I think everything that I'm saying, you have to be very careful in this sense. I can only say that, yes, coronavirus has a very typical symptoms as far as we see now. So it has this fever, increase in fever, cough that is quite specific. And so I think it's not necessarily the same as panic. There are also other symptoms that seem to be correlated. For example, now they're finding that it seems to be correlated also with loss of smell and taste, which is something that still it's not clear how it's happening. But actually, there is a very interesting connection between the changes in the immune system and smell and taste as well. So these are other aspects. And I think it's also panic attacks are probably more limited in time and versus corona, which is more chronic in this sense.
So David, go ahead if you want.
Yes, first of all, I just want to mention that if you have a question for Professor Rolls, please look at the bottom strip on your window, and it says Q&A, and you're welcome to ask a question. Looking at the questions that have come in as well, Professor Rolls, there are questions about Technion researchers and Technion students around COVID-19, and I'm wondering if you can offer any reflections on what is happening on the campus right now in terms of that kind of research.
Well, actually, it's a very exciting time in terms of seeing how people are joining the effort in so many different ways. And I can talk a little bit of some of the research that I'm aware of going on, but there is something that I think is, for me, it's amazing. We know that many of the people who are working in the labs that are testing doing the tests for corona, many of them are actually being infected. And then they're being confined, and there is a very big limit in how many people can work in these labs. And I was amazed to see how just so many of our students just went and volunteered so they can do shifts in the hospital and replace, and so the labs can still keep working all night and do more and more tests. And I think they're doing that knowing that they're probably exposing themselves to the virus, and I find it amazing. We are donating parts of, so for example, many parts, like a lot of our equipment, like hoods and PCR machines is something that is missing, and now we are collecting them to start expanding the facilities so we can test more and more people. And I think it's an amazing effort that is being done, and the willingness of people to just join the effort in to try and help. There are also a lot of specific experiments or directions that are being done. It's amazing. So we have one researcher that he's working on the receptor, part of the proteins that are involved in the interaction between the virus and the host. And he was like looking all over to Israel for someone who can do something so he can isolate the protein and the others can work on it. So there are lots of efforts being done and people are trying to find connections. I know that Rui Kishoni in the biology department, for example, found a way of pulling and doing, I think, so many tests all together instead of doing one by one. So we can get many more analyzed at once, many more people. I think there are a lot of efforts being, so there is a lot of effort also going on between, with the hospital. We are also involved trying to find a way of, so, you know, basically you don't need to hospitalize most of the people. It's only about 10 to 20% that need hospitalization, but the others can stay at home and recover. But we don't know who is going to who is going to kind of escalate. So we're trying to find a way, and we're working with the hospital to find a way to kind of detect those who are on the verge of escalating so they can be hospitalized at home instead of the hospital. And I think just seeing how everyone are joining the effort, and people are writing like, how can we do, what can we do to help? And I think it's exciting time. Our students are also bringing food for elderly people in the neighborhood. I think it's beautiful to see how much of the positive it brings out of people, and the togetherness. This feeling is something very special.
So one of our good friends just asked, in cancer, our immune system is depressed, while in IBD it is overreacting. How do our feelings modulate that?
It's a very good point. Well, it's true. One of the problems, it's all about balance. And I think this is, the main point. It has to be balanced and appropriate to the condition. So for example, in irritable bowel disease, it's indeed, and actually this is interesting. If you talk to gastroenterologists, many of them say like 90% of the patients that come to us will tell us that they know what was the emotional episode that started this inflammation. They kind of correlate with specific events. And on the other end, so it seems that, and this is part of it, so emotional triggers can actually activate them both. In the context of, can both induce immune activity and suppress immune activity. It's a matter of balancing, having the right immune activity. And for example, what we see, one of the arguments and one of the hypotheses is why, for example, long-term stress, chronic stress induced is causing this immune suppression, is because it's constantly causing some level of inflammation, low level of inflammation, that in the end, the body starts activating pathways that are suppressing the immune response. So it's kind of a say, okay, the body cannot tolerate. The immune system is it's a very interesting thing, because it's a system that can kill, right? We can die because our immune system is overactivated, sepsis. So you have to balance it very carefully. So if you have an ongoing inflammation, the body says at some point, okay, so we're probably not going, it's not so terrible, so let's start suppressing the pathways, the immune system. And if you're starting to suppress, then it's an opportunity for cancer, for example, to emerge. So it's really about having the balance, because the brain seems to be able both to activate the immune response and suppress it. And we now have data showing that it can actually activate very specific immune reactions, which is shocking to me, actually.
So let me switch gears for 1 second. With children, do parents' reactions to, for example, an injury, something not life-threatening necessarily, falling off a bike or a swing, affect the way the child experiences pain, or is there no research on that yet?
I think, well, I can talk for my children, right? If everyone knows the case that if you give them a Band-Aid, especially it has a Superman sticker on it, then it helps the pain, right? So I think the connection with kids, and kids actually responding very strongly to placebo. And I think a very important part of the placebo is how we are social animals. And there are actually even studies in rats. Rats will respond stronger if there is another rat that is crying next to them, so they will start crying more. So it's that intuitively embedded in us. We are social animals. We are looking into those who are around us. So I think, and kids are known to be very responsive to placebo, persuasion in general.
So get out your crystal ball.
Yeah.
How different will medical treatment look 25 years from now? Example, will we be much less reliant on pharmaceuticals?
I think the pharmaceutical industry is going a major shift. I think they're understanding that things are not going to be the same. I think the use, we see now, and I think I think it's a natural phase that we were going through, right? We were so excited that we isolated the bacteria, Pasteur did it. So we started to decipher things slowly into their individual components, and we learned every system individually. But I think now we are finding that the body is not a collection of individual systems. We have to start looking at that as an organism. And I think this is the major change, because we have wonderful drugs that can kill the people because all of the side effects. So I think it's going to change a lot first, because we are going to have a different perspective that is going to be much broader and systemic, instead of being focused on giving one drug that is shifting everything else. So it's clear that we can no longer interfere very locally and and I think the immunotherapy, for example, all these treatments that are boosting the immune response to fight cancer, they are just one example of the direction that we are going towards, harnessing the endogenous capacity to fight disease in general. I hope that all these new pathways and all this understanding of the brain's potential is going to integrate there. I think we are going to see much more of that. We definitely see the interest of the industry in that. And I think the pharmaceutical industry is in the verge of a very big crisis, also because of the placebo effect. I don't know if you know, but the placebo is rising dramatically. So for example, many drugs for the pain field, it's dramatic, because in recent years there were barely any drugs approved, because when we're doing the placebo trial and we're giving one group sugar pill and the other one the actual drug, and the actual drug should have a stronger effect than the sugar pill. But what is happening is the sugar pill, the response is going up. So people just responding to the sugar pill so fast, so barely any drugs are going to pass the FDA. So in this sense, they will have to cope with the placebo, which is a psychological factor. So I think this is definitely going to affect the pharmaceutical industry.
So several of our participants asked questions about Italy. And they were curious about how a country where families have such strong social networks, close family ties, and they have not fared very well in this crisis. And they were basically asking, do you have any thoughts on this as the fabric of society?
It's a very good point. I think in this sense, you say, okay, so they're very social, they have a lot of social support, so how they are not coping much better. But we have to understand the virus is a virus, right? The immune system you can boost the immune system, but you don't have to be exposed to the virus. And I have friends from Italy, actually, I'm part of this WhatsApp group we're a lot of European neuroscientists, and every night they're plotting all the plots that they get, all the results every night. And one of them is Italian, and she keeps saying, she's like, people here don't listen. They keep going to all these meetings and all these family gatherings, and they just kept spreading the virus. They didn't, even now they're trying to catch the people who are, even now when everyone is dying there, they just still don't care about that. And I'm thinking also countries when it's a matter of how many kisses you're supposed to have when you meet someone. I wonder if they're going to correlate it as well. How many kisses you give when you say hello, if at some point it's going to correlate with the spreading of corona. I think they're very emotionally.
So a few questions. Meditation, yoga, how do they build the immune system? Jewish spirituality, the Talmud, are there correlations that you've found in these things?
So there are studies doing that. So from what we are doing, we are actually, when we are activating the reward system is activated in many of these cases, right? It's activated when in religious belief, for example, there's activation of these centers. So that's how we are looking at that. And I think this is why it's properly correlated. But there are also studies that actually looked at that in humans. So there are connections between people who have strong belief, who have strong sense of goal, and their ability to cope with disease. So it's there. There are also, and again, with the limitations of every epidemiological study, as I mentioned before. But in the case, for example, of meditation and all of these techniques work a lot on the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. When you're regulating your breath, when you're controlling your stress levels with the meditations and all of that, so you are changing something in your physiology. And as I'm saying, I think that we're saying all this mental world, all our thoughts, it's like it's metaphysics and our body is physical. No, they are connected. So every thought it doesn't come from somewhere. It's actually embedded in our neurons. So I think when we are changing it, when we're changing the wiring, and for example, one of the interesting things we see that people who meditate, they can actually control the activity of specific brain area more intensely when we are doing this neurofeedback that we are doing with Professor Endler. So it's interesting. I think they're controlling their brain a bit differently.
So here's one that's very personal. I just got an email from our good friend Rod Feldman, who's a board member in New York and a national board member. He says, Jerry, your colorful sweater brightened my mood. Now, is there any scientific evidence, or is he just, playing up to me?
Well, it definitely flatters you, so you can you keep it with the positive energy, and it's good.
I feel good about it.
As long as you feel good about it. Exactly.
So this is a crazy world we live in. A lot of people have asked, several people have asked questions, when this is all over, how do we stay sane? What do we learn going forward? What does your research say about responding to these kinds of trauma, maybe year after year or decade after decade? How does one cope during a lifetime and learn during a lifetime?
Well, I think I cannot answer that as a scientist. I can also answer that as a person. I think these are this is because I don't think we have any answers. I think we will learn, and probably there are going to be so many studies coming up on what we're experiencing now. We are definitely a very special time in history. But I do hope that as humanity, we are going to take this opportunity to reflect on where we are, to see how we can connect. I think it's amazing to see. I'm amazed. Like I have all the time I have on my phone people from all over the world and how they're trying to connect and to interact. What is happening here? I think there are so many opportunities that are also emerging, and there are people who are going to pay a terrible price for that, including a price in their life. But I hope that as a society, we're going to take the opportunity, even just think. I know for sure that I'm going to reflect on many things. For example, how many travels, or it's wonderful. I'm stuck here in my room. I'm so excited about it. I don't travel as much, and I think there are many things that we can take from that. And I hope, at least from, if I'm taking now it for the scientist, I hope that we'll take it for the good times. But yes, stress definitely affects our physiology. It can even, and there are now studies that it's not only stays with us, it's even embedded in our genes in epigenetically. So it changes even our genes in a way, and it can be passed on to other generations. So I hope we'll pass the good from that.
Professor, is there a correlation between the viruses that are part of our evolutionary structure and our reaction to these viral diseases?
If I'm getting it correctly, I think it's a wonderful question, because we see, for example, so we have two types of, the way our body copes with the immune system has two components. One is the innate immune system. This is the one that we are born with. It's a selection of targets that the immune system will respond automatically, even if we never saw it. And the other one is the one that it's more sophisticated, the adaptive immune system. And this one will have the specific antibodies that it will develop. This is the vaccinations that we are doing. But these selection of innate receptors, things that are being recognized, even in an animal that never, or us, that we never saw this bacteria, I think this is a reflection of our evolution. So these receptors, or these things that we recognize innately, they are things that were crucial for our ancestors. And this is part of how they were selected. So I think in many ways, our immune system now is a reflection of our ancestors' experiences, and probably plagues that, like the one that we are witnessing now.
So we have a question from the Prince family, one of our best friends, and from the Prince Center. If a person is not depressed, but has negative feelings about treatment and its effectiveness, has negative feelings about treatment and its effectiveness, will the treatment work?
Actually, there is a phenomena for that called Nocebo. Nocebo is like the evil brother of placebo. And it was shown that if people are thinking negatively, so that this drug is going to cause them harm, they are actually manifested the side effects that they thought they are going to experience. So it's actually a known phenomena that people can actually harm themselves by just by thinking that this is going to harm them.
What about your work or the work of others in this area with those who may have dementia or are bipolar or have other debilitating situations? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
So there are two directions to that. One, there are some so the connection, the dialogue between the brain and the immune system is bidirectional. It's not only that what's happening, our thoughts or our state, for example, depression affects our physiology, our immune system, it's also vice versa. There are some studies even indicating that some of these mental conditions actually initiated by a bacteria or by infection, and then the ensuing immune response then alters activity in the brain. So there are quite few evidence for that. And I think many of these, many mental conditions are associated with changes in the immune response, including, for example, postpartum depression seems to have a component which is immune, and the schizophrenia is strongly correlated with changes in the immune system. Now there are studies, evidence also on Alzheimer's. So I think there are many directions in this sense, suggesting that that the connection is bidirectional, and that that you can see comorbidity or interactions between the changes in the brain and mental states or mental disorders and changes in the immune system. And we don't know which is the egg and which is the chicken.
Jerry, I think we can have time for one more question.
There are all sorts of other questions, but there is one interesting one that just popped up, at least in front of me. We hear that COVID-19 is affecting the lungs. Any idea of how to strengthen our lungs by breathing exercises, calm down techniques, enjoy bright colors, like the pink sweater? I didn't even realize that till I got to that part of
it. Well, I think in this sense, we still don't know, and I don't think I can give you any responsible answer in this sense. But because we still don't know what's going on there and how I think the best way is just to avoid it. Try to stay at home. So maybe just don't get infected is probably the best way. But we don't know why, for example, kids are not so affected by that, while there is a dip in the 40s and the 50s, and then elderly people are also affected. So it seems to have some factors which might be immune related or might be related to other things, related to heart activity. So we don't know, but I think some things cannot hurt, right? So maybe let's take it on this direction. Just even if it just keeps you in a better mood and makes you feel that you're doing something good. So why not?
Thank you. David, I'll turn this back to you.
Thank you, Jerry. You did a wonderful job. And Professor Rolls, thank you so much for spending time with our Technion community here in the US and really around the world today. And, you know, looking at my phone, I realized that it's almost 7 p.m. for you. So we really appreciate you spending part of your evening. And I want to recognize that so much of your life and your work has been put on hold, just as it has for most everyone who joined this call. And between family obligations and working with your graduate students and keeping in touch with them and everything else going on in your lives, we greatly appreciate that you gave us these insights and talked about the power of the mind to deal with some very acute matters impacting our lives, as well as other situations such as how we just cope with disease and other challenges in our lives. So I just want to let you know how deeply appreciative we are of your presence here today. For all those who joined us, we really hope that you enjoyed this webinar. We hope that you found it to be informational and inspiring. Certainly at this time, any good news is worth its weight beyond gold. And we hope that you will be able to join us again next Wednesday, which will be April 1st. We're not looking at it as April Fools. It will be starting at 12 p.m. East Coast time, 9 a.m. on the West Coast. And for those of you in other time zones, I'm sure you'll be able to figure out the correct one for you. Our speaker will be Associate Professor Noam Adir of the Technion's Schulich Faculty of Chemistry. And his topic will be the quest to develop new antimicrobial drugs. Obviously a very important topic at this time. You should receive an invitation for this shortly or have already done so before. And once again, on behalf of the American Technion Society and Technion University in Israel, thank you for joining us and thank you for your support, friendship, and commitment to the Technion. With that, I wish you all a great day and we look forward to seeing you again in the very near future. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being with you today. Bye. Thank you.